Okay, so this is a heavily modified Kyosho Lazer Alpha, also known as a Kyosho Lazer 2000, I guess depending on the region of the world that you're in. And the thing with the Lazer Alpha is that it was essentially kind of like, if you take a Tamiya Top Force and compare it to a Manta Ray, the Manta Ray had more plastic parts in various parts of the build, or rather like a Top Force Evolution, for example, and compare that to a Manta Ray. The Manta Ray is the budget version. The Kyosho Lazer Alpha is a budget version of the Kyosho Lazer. So they have it has a molded tub chassis, a plastic tub chassis, and then the front and rear gearboxes, even though they look very similar to those on the ZXR and the ZX, it is made of the same molded plastic as the chassis, to cut down on cost. The shock towers are like molded shock towers with fixed mounting points. It's a very basic chassis. But what's kind of neat about the classic class for Vonats is that, at least for the plastic cars, the plastic tub chassis is the key feature. And because the Lazer Alpha is essentially a cheap version of the better lasers, you can take a lot of laser parts and just plug them right into the Lazer Alpha chassis. So that's what I did here. And I kind of did this in response to a friend of mine who did the same thing. I think 2019 was the first year that he did it, or 2020 was the first year that he did it. 2 years ago. About a year and a half ago. And he ran that at Vonats the year that I couldn't go after my daughter was born, and he blitzed the field with it. So I came back this year with my dirt thrasher, and we were very close on pace. I managed to win, and so he asked me to make my own version of a Lazer Alpha with Lazer ZXR modifications to it, so that we can race against each other on with essentially the same or very similar cars. So what did I do? Well, I did a lot of stuff here, and I'm going to go through as much of it as I can in a reasonable amount of time in this video. So what you can do is take a ZXR, unbolt everything, and bolt it straight onto this chassis for the most part. The gearboxes are a direct fit. The inner hinge pin mounts are a direct fit. It's all pretty much a direct fit. My original plan, by the way, which is why I kept this under wraps for a while, was to make this a plastic tub chassis of a ZXS Evolution. And so one of the other reasons why I wanted to get the molded parts for the ZXS sort of reproduced in 3D printing was so I could put it on this and make a plastic tub version of a ZXS Evo. I thought that would be really cool. The only problem is when I actually tried to do that, what I realized is the mounting points for the front and rear gearboxes are different between the ZXS and the ZXR. The spacing between the screws that go into the bottom side of the chassis to mount the gearbox is a little bit wider on the ZXS than it is for the ZXR. And since this plastic tub chassis is compatible with the ZXR components, you cannot actually turn this into a plastic ZXS. At least not without basically taking the holes that are there and taking a Dremel to them, and basically, like, if I turn this over for a second here, I'd have to take it like this hole and gouge out a section over here and gouge out a section over here on each of these 4 holes, and then put those front gearbox components on from the ZXS and try to line it up perfectly left to right so it's perfectly symmetric. It's technically possible, but it would be a very, very sloppy build. So I figured it's probably easier to just take a ZXR and just slap it on here. So I have, if you go way, way, way back in my video history, my very, very first Lazer that I did as a project car, that was a ZX that I converted to a ZXR. And I basically took that car and put it on a shelf for years. I never ran it. I never really did anything with it. So I figured I would just take that and rip it apart and put it on this. And as I was doing that, I realized that there were things I did in that build that could have been better. So as I was moving those components over, I sort of tweaked things a bit to make the rolling resistance smaller, to fix some of the mistakes I had made. So, this is actually quite nice now. So, okay, what do we have here? Front gearbox, pretty, basic stuff from a ZXR. Only differences are like the aluminum front and rear inner hinge pin mounts. These are from Pargu Racing. I really like those inner hinge pin mounts. They're very strong, so I like to use them everywhere. Ball diffs front and rear. So these are actually, one of these is the ball diff I took out of the ZXS Evo because I had replaced it with a proper ball diff to go on the Evo. And that ball diff, I just rebuilt it and slapped it in here. And then the other one is a ball diff from some other build that I had that was just lying around, and I just threw it in there. So front and rear ball diffs. In the internals of the gearboxes front and rear, I replaced all of the roller bushings with roller bearings. And the trick that you do, one little trick you can do to make the rolling resistance as low as possible is instead of using two 2x6 roller bearings, just use one. And that one, if you just use one, it will set onto the middle of the belt and it'll work just fine. It's probably not going to make a huge difference in terms of the overall amount of drag you have within the drivetrain because the bearings are pretty low friction. But I really want to try to minimize rolling friction here. Because again, this is a power limited class. For the classic class, you just get a sport tuned motor. What else did I do? I'm using the LA27 caster blocks. So those are the stock caster blocks from the ZX and the ZXR. I decided not to use the LA59 caster blocks, which would widen the front and give me more front caster. I at least want to try it with this, in part because I have plenty of LA27 spares, and I want to save all my LA59s for my ZXRR that I use for the classic four-wheel drive class. I am using aluminum steering knuckles, though. These are, I think, from the Optima. They plug right in. The turnbuckles, I think they're titanium. I got these years ago. They're from 3 Racing. They're just these really tiny units. Even if they're steel, they're so thin that they should be pretty lightweight. I do have a spare blue steering rack here that I decided to just throw in. One thing to point out is in setting up this steering rack for this chassis, the chassis itself has a molding that comes out that you mount the steering rack on with, like, you put the post in the molding and then you put the steering rack on that with the bearings. So you don't need, normally you'd have some spacers that go under the steering rack between that and the lower deck on the post. You don't need that here because that molding comes up. But you do have to manage the spacing between the top of the rack, and in this case what I did is I put an upper deck on here so that there's no play, vertical play. Okay, fine. So I'm going to actually get to this upper deck soon in a minute. And then for the rear gearbox, what did I do here that was different? Again, just fiddling with the roller bearings, make it nice and smooth. This lay shaft is actually a lay shaft I got from one of the lasers I purchased, where the guy basically tried to make a cheap version of the hyperclutch. So this has a locked center pulley here. I think it's like a one-piece molded unit that was made for the Spider TF4, maybe. And it does simplify the setup here for the pulleys, which is great. And it's also molded, which means it's lightweight. There's no aluminum drive hubs or anything like that. So this should have lower rotational mass than, like, a ZXR slipper clutch assembly. And this particular person took I don't know what lay shaft it is, but they set it up so you can fit an RC10 style, a stealth gearbox style slipper hub on there. So this is an RC10 slipper clutch. But what's great about that is I can mount any Kimbrough spur gear I want on this, or Robinson spur gear I want on this. So instead of that massive Kyosho, was it 102 spur gear, I can put something a little smaller on there, which is important for gearing up the laser for classic class. Again, sport tune motor, you need higher gearing because these motors don't spin that fast. So this is, you can do the same thing with a hyperclutch. But hyperclutches are rare and expensive. This is just a simpler, cheaper way of getting to the same end point. So we have that. We also have the rear shock tower here, which is mounted with an O-ring and a little spacer here up against the screw that mounts through the tower onto the rear shock tower mount right here. Okay, and I did, and you do that on all 4 screws. I did the same thing on my ZXRR. If you go back to that build series, I did the same exact thing. The whole point of doing this is so that if you flip the car over, usually you're going forward when you flip, so that's going to put stress on the tower going to the rear. The O-ring is going to absorb that stress, or at least some of it, and so you're less likely to break this part right here, which is a very hard to find part. Okay, let's see. MIP CVDs, these are chrome CVDs. They just, again, those were part of my that original laser project. I just decided to put them on here because I thought it would look kind of cool. And, you know, I thought about maybe saving these for another shelfer, but these are for the standard width front and rear setup for the laser, which means if I use the LA59 caster blocks up front, which widens the front, I wouldn't be able to use these CVDs. And so I figured this is probably the only laser where I really care to have these LA27 caster blocks. So why don't I just throw the CVDs in there? Standard wheel hexes right now. I am considering getting the A&L Factory Works. I think they make like a plus 6mm or plus 8mm wheel hex, which will allow me to widen either or both of the front and rear. So I may order those as a tuning option. And that might be enough to more or less give me what I'm looking for like, let's say, dulling down the steering response if these LA27 caster blocks have too sharp of a steering response. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. What else? Yeah, the upper deck. So the thing with the Lazer Alpha is that it didn't actually come with an upper deck. You have this molded chassis. And then there was this, it's almost like a waterfall assembly that goes in the front. So it would mount here between these 2 holes into the front gearbox, and then over the steering rack, and then down, I think, to this hole here, and another one on the other side. And that would kind of brace the front chassis from flexing. There are a few, well, the primary problem with that part is that the holes for the 2 front holes that mount onto the top of the gearbox would only fit a 3mm screw thread. But the holes that go into the Lazer ZXR or Lazer ZX gearbox, those take a 4mm thread. So the Lazer Alpha front gearbox actually takes 3mm thread screws for these top 2 screws here. And then the sort of upgraded laser parts take 4mm thread. So I couldn't use that. I had to go to a more conventional upper deck. This is a 2-piece upper deck, which is from the Lazer ZX. There's just a left and a right half. So basically, I mounted that onto the front gearbox on either side, and then that goes over the steering rack. And because there's not a whole lot of extra threading here, I used M3 lock nuts flipped upside down with the threading side, or the nylon locking side going in first, so I could have good control over how tight I make this, so I don't screw it down too tight and end up binding up the steering rack. And then at some point over here on either side, here on this side, and then over here I just went straight into the chassis over here. You see there's a little standoff post there so that I can screw a screw. I drilled a hole from the underside right there. Maybe you can see that screw right there, So I just have a way to brace the backside of this upper deck so it doesn't flop around. And then I kind of did, you know, a very similar thing here where I just took a spare steering post that I had, and then I just add an extra little standoff here to, you know, make up the gap, to make this nice and level. Drill the hole here, right? Screwed that in. So I had to also countersink that hole on the bottom and then put another screw in on the top. And so now I have, you know, a left and right upper deck that, you know, mounts on this. And, you know, there's maybe a little bit of flexing toward the rear here because I don't have like an L bracket to mount this up against this wall here, but I'm not too worried about that. What's key about doing this is it will mitigate any flex in the chassis. Again, this is a molded chassis. If you don't do this and you don't run that front waterfall, that chassis is going to flex a lot. And it affects the belt tension. If it flexes up like this, the belt gets loose. Now, since I'm running all these roller bearings in here, that's not really going to matter because the roller bearings help to hold the belts down onto the pulleys. But still, you want to try to minimize that chassis flex because it can lead to some unpredictability in the performance of the car anyway. So this was my solution. What my friend did with his was to make a bunch of like little carbon fiber parts that he would put in different parts of the chassis to help stiffen up the molded chassis more or less, you know, from the actual bottom itself. I didn't do that. I just used sort of the existing parts that I had without modifying anything. Let's see, is there anything else to mention here? One thing that's kind of a gripe that I have about the Lazer Alpha chassis is that there's all these cutouts on the bottom. So, you know, it does leave itself open to some exposure for dirt to get in there. So one thing you might want to do is, you know, maybe cut some Lexan out and, you know, tape it down, or maybe drill a hole or two to screw it down to sort of seal this off from dirt getting in, or just run an under tray. So for example, if I come over here, so this is the body and under tray for a more conventional Lazer ZX style body. And I believe this would fit just perfectly. So I'm probably going to just mount this under tray, in which case I don't have to worry about, you know, these cutouts here on the chassis, and then I'll just mount the body on the Velcro, you know, pieces I put here on the side for the under tray, and that'll solve that problem. The only other thing I have to do here is to figure out the battery mounting, because this is meant to accept a sideways mounted NiCad pack. So you have this rounded profile here on this brace and on this other brace here. I'm going to put either a shorty or an ultra shorty in here, so I'm probably going to have to cut one or both of these out and come up with some way of holding the shorty in from the side to keep it from flopping around. So I got to sort that out, as well as the electronics. And then I have to also set the car up, the suspension, and the gearing. I got to figure out the gearing that I need to run for this car. But otherwise, it's, you know, ready to go. Let's see, is there anything else worth mentioning? Not really. I figured I'd run the original sort of Kyosho Gold shocks here. I have all kinds of different sets of Kyosho shocks. These are, let's say, proper vintage. So I figured I'd run those. It looks like, I know on the front, I haven't taken apart the rears in a while, but it does have fresh oil in it from when I did the first build all those years ago. But the front has 4-hole pistons, so I had to use thicker oil to give it the right amount of damping. But anyway, that's, you know, some tuning I'll have to get to later, as I'm really tuning this thing. But it looks like this would be good competition for the Tamiya Dirt Thrasher / Manta Ray. Very low rolling resistance, right? It doesn't bind up or anything. It's actually quite good. So I think this will be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to getting this set up and running it at Vonets this year. So I'm thinking, instead of running my tried and true Dirt Thrasher, which I've done several times, probably going to run this. Which will be really good, because if I bring my Lazer ZX RR, then I'll have 2 lasers to play with, which is kind of what I was always wanting to do anyway. So, I guess that's it for now. Thanks for watching.